Hi, I'm Brandon Lucero, and you're about to experience the new way to thrive in business, entrepreneurship, and life by leaning into who you are, what you love, and standing up for what you want to create. Get ready, because this is where we go against the grain, say no to outdated society norms, and we say yes to change in order to create a happier, more fulfilled world. Welcome to the New Generation Entrepreneur Podcast. All right. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of the New Generation Entrepreneur Podcast. I'm super excited to have you guys here. We've been doing a series on the podcast all about messaging. We've talked about a lot of different things. And so to kind of wrap out this series, I thought it'd be really cool to bring on our head coach to talk about some of the things that we see with our students. So there's a lot of mistakes that people make with their messaging, which obviously probably some of you guys have recognized that you are making. Obviously, we're here to fix that. And hopefully the podcast has helped you fix that. And hopefully you are considering joining New Generation Mastery, where we continue to help you with that. But I just thought it'd be really, really valuable to kind of go through some of the mistakes that not only do we see our audience make, but what do we see our students make? Like, what are some of the biggest shifts that we have to get our students to make in order for them to see amazing messaging and have these massive breakthroughs? So I invited, again, Rachel Duffy, our head coach, onto the podcast with us today. So Rachel, welcome to the podcast again.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. I think this was it your second or third time on the podcast?
Are we counting? I don't know. Am I the most often guest that we've had? I hope so. That's my aim. That's my goal.
You or James. I don't know. You or James. Could
James,
be one or the other. Who's
Again.
James? No one cares about James though. Yeah. So, and everyone always loves the episodes that we do. And so I thought this would be a great one. I just wanted to, obviously have that conversation of what are the biggest mistakes we see our students makes, or biggest paradigm shifts that they have to make in order to see great messaging. And I kind of want to get your perspective on it. I know we talked before the podcast and I have a few written down, but from your perspective, what are some of the biggest issues you see our students making or having or going through that stops them from uncovering their powerful messaging?
I love this topic because as head coach, I kind of have this perspective overviewing all the NGM students and the NGM Plus students, where I really get to see up close what people are struggling with. And there have been recurring themes. So for starters, when we talk about the problems that we solve for our people, there are several mistakes that keep repeating. Number one, people don't know what problems they solve.
Yeah.
And when they do know them, they don't know them at a very granular, specific way to communicate to their audience, to make their audience raise their hand and say, hey, that's me you're talking about.
Right.
I think a lot of times the people we work with, certainly inside of NGM Plus, but this is true in NGM as well, we work with people who are true masters of their craft. And when you've been doing something for a while and you've gained mastery in it, it is easy to forget what the experience is like in step 0, because you're already in step 100.
Right.
But getting back down to that step 0 and meeting people there in the problem, in the pain, in the symptoms, in the way your audience experiences that pain.
Yeah.
That, I would say, is the number one thing students trip up over.
Okay. This could take us down so many different paths, because it's like, well, how do you figure out those problems? How do you get granular? How do you, there's just so many different directions we can go. But you said something that I want to address and highlight, where you said that they are truly masters of their craft. And I have a little bit different perspective on it. I think a lot of them are, like, they're masters of their craft. They're very skilled, but they're very knowledgeable and they have a lot of experience. But there are also people that are not masters of their craft yet. And we have to get them to become masters of their craft. And here's the difference for anyone who's wondering where you fit. From my perspective, and Rachel, you can add on to this if you want, or correct me or whatever, but the way I look at it is, if you're a master of your craft, it means you have the knowledge and the skills combined with a lot of experience. And then there's also the people who are experts, but they don't have the experience yet. So what they are is the only thing they can do is just regurgitate their knowledge. And that's all you do. But when you don't have the experience or the mastery, it's like, how are you supposed to understand what mistakes people are making or what their thoughts are or what their emotions are? I mean, you literally can't. And so we have to get them to be masters of their craft as well. I mean, have you noticed that within our students as
You
well?
know, that's a good point you bring up because I do see that our students kind of divide into two major groups. One group is the group that does have mastery because they do have the experience and understanding the solution
Hmm.
and the problem from multiple different angles, right? So
Right.
once you've had X years of experience doing the thing you're doing, you do have a deeper understanding of it. And then it's a matter of us helping you communicate that. But you're right that there is also a group of students in our ecosystem that are maybe newer to what they're doing and they do have knowledge, but they don't necessarily have knowing. And if those terms are new to you, we've unpacked this on the podcast multiple times before. With those students, I actually think it is more an issue of them uncovering the problems their audience is willing to pay for. I
Yeah.
think
That's,
that is the problem, though that group experiences more so than not being,
I,
than speaking from the solution rather than the problem. Does that make sense?
100%. And I think actually both camps, whether you have a lot of experience or don't have a lot of experience. And by the way, if you find yourself, you're an expert and you're like, I just have a lot of knowledge, but no experience, that's totally fine. But just know that like we have a testing phase, especially in NGM plus, it's just going to require a little bit more work in the testing phase. You can still find out what's going to work and not work. But when we work with someone that has the experience, they kind of generally know, okay, there's this, this, and this, and we just have to laser in. Whereas if you're the expert space and you're just kind of like speaking from knowledge, there's a little bit more testing that needs to go in. But it's again, it's still the same process. But like you said, both camps really what we've recognized have not done the work yet, not because they just are, just don't like doing work. Obviously you guys do. It's because you just didn't know you were supposed to, but it comes down to figuring out the problems that people are willing to pay for in order to get solved. And sometimes a lot of you guys are just choosing problems that people are okay dealing with. And that becomes a really big problem. You're trying to sell them something because they're like, nah, I'd rather keep my money and this is okay. So with that being said, what would you say the first thing is to uncovering what those problems are going to be?
So I think before you even get to uncovering the problems, you first have to drill into your mind the mindset, the approach, the attitude of a science experiment. And I know
Yeah.
that you've used that metaphor before, and it is really something you have to drill into your mind. If you are an entrepreneur, you are a scientist. You may
Yeah.
not have liked science class in high school, but here you are. The way I look at messaging is, yeah, we have a lot of knowing and we share that with our students. And you specifically, Brandon, have a ton of just not just knowing, but also intuitively, you're just so gifted with messaging. And that's not enough. We have to
Right.
test. We have to test for the purpose of finding the gaps. And then when we find the gaps in our messaging, then we can help you fill in those gaps real easy. But
Right.
we don't always know the gaps either. So, testing, the way I look at testing, even in my own business, is I hope it breaks. I hope it breaks something. I hope it
Mhm.
reveals a gap. I hope I fail because then I can do something about it.
Right. And I'm just going to tell you guys, if you're on the fence with NGM and you're considering whether you want to get in or not, like I'm not going to beat around the bush. You're going to have to get used to testing and you're going to have to get used to like, I don't know, 70 to 90% of your content not working, especially in the beginning. And then that ratio starts to change as we get more data. We start to analyze it. We start to see, and we can make decisions on where to shift and change. But like, we want nothing more than see every student succeed. And as a coach, it sometimes is frustrating when people are very slow and need our approval and everything before they post it, because I know like if I help you on a hot seat and then 1 week later you still haven't done a post yet and you're like, then you create the post and you need my approval, it's like, gosh, you're just wasting time because it's going to take testing. And so my question to you, Rachel, is even though we preach testing, we know it's required because I mean, just is. We just don't know what's going to work and land and how. Because again, we need to know what to say and how to say it, and all both of those take testing. But when we see, and sometimes we see people that test right away, they're like, I had 3 posts today. I did 3 more today. I did 3 more the next day. I ran ads. Like some people are on it, but then some people are like, it takes them a week just to write a script.
Right.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think some people avoid the testing phase?
I mean, on a scale of 1 to 10, how deep do you want us to go here?
Well, I think let's keep it surface level and then we'll go as deep as we can, I guess. I don't know. But knowing you, you like to start at the 10. So let's start at 1 and then we'll
But look at my own growth. I
yeah,
asked on a scale of 1 to 10, that's my personal growth.
yeah,
Honestly, I think it's about people having to give themselves the permission to post without our permission. I think people
yeah.
seek permission, generally
But
speaking.
but like, but why do they seek the permission? Is it because they don't want to do it? And this is my perspective: is they think there's a wrong and a right way to do it,
Yeah, they're
and
afraid of
yes,
doing it
there's right, and they don't want to get it wrong. And look, there are frameworks and there are processes, and there is a way to do it better than others. But in my opinion, there's not really a wrong way to do it because even if you didn't, you didn't follow the framework 100%, or there's one way you could have done it a little bit better. It's a lot better to put out more content at 60 to 70% perfect and quicker than it is to put out one at 100% perfect. And so a lot of times when we work with students, our feedback is, I don't see any red flags. So go
wrong.
and post it. Although there are ways to improve it, as long as there's no major issues or no-nos, then you should go ahead and post it. And that's the thing is I think a lot of people don't want to do it wrong. They think there's a right way, a wrong way. But what we talked about before the podcast is they get too attached to the
Mhm.
result of every single piece of content or every single ad.
Yeah,
And this is a disaster for not just your messaging, but all of your marketing and running a business is when you're too attached to every single little element. So do
right.
you want to expand on that?
I do, and I think it's very tricky, specifically the people we work with, because we tend to attract people who are very mission driven,
Mhm.
purpose driven, who have a deeper reason for why they became entrepreneurs more than just, oh, I want to F the 9 to 5.
Right.
So when you're talking to that subset of entrepreneurs, it is important to them. It is wrapped up in deeper parts of their identity, right? So we have to, at the same time, maintain that deeper purpose, maintain that connection, the ripple effects of the impact of what our business could have and why we're doing this in the first place, and completely detach from
Right.
the outcome in the moment, right? The testing outcome, whatever it is, good, bad, I mean, I don't even label it that way. It just is. It's a number. It's a
Right.
neutral number, right? This was the engagement. This was the cost per lead. This is how much I spent on ads. This is how many views I got. These are just numbers. They have no charge in and of themselves until I give them charge. So
Right.
I think this is why it's hard for entrepreneurs, specifically the ones we work with, is because they do care. And
Yeah.
this isn't just a money-making business, but you have to be able to make that switch when you're testing messaging and realize that it does not actually, it's not a reflection of who you are or how good you are or how big your business is going to be, or, all the things we make it mean in our own minds.
Right. And just to give like a very surface level example, so just to make sure every dot connects for all the listeners is like, if you, let's just say you do a list method post or something like that, and you work really well on it and you think you understand very well the problems, and then you put it out there and it doesn't do well. And maybe you even get one comment that says like, this is stupid. What Rachel's talking about is like, now what do you do at that point? Are you the type of person who gets into an emotional spiral downward where you're like depressed and sad and making it, and now you're telling yourself you're not worthy, you're not good enough, or you're going like, okay, that communication style didn't work, let me try again and figure out what works, when there isn't really no emotion attached to the result that you got. And that's where we want to be. And again, and going back to the whole point why we're even talking about this is I think that's why a lot of our students, they just won't post quick enough because they're way too attached to either doing it right or they're trying to avoid the
Yes.
negative stuff. But when we look at it from purely a science experiment, at least for me, in my mind, it reframes it completely different. It reframes it as, this is just a test. I'm going to get data, and I'm going to take that data to make an educational or an educated decision on what to do next. And then over that process, you start to really fine tune what works and what doesn't. And it does come down to speed. Like, you may have to do 100 posts before you get your messaging figured out enough to generate consistent sales. And how long it takes you to do those 100 posts, completely up to you. We've had
Right.
some students where they're still doing it 2 years later, and we had some students that did it in 30 days.
That's right.
Is totally, totally up to you and how fast you want to go. Okay. So if someone or a student is finding themselves in that spiral, like too attached to the result, what would you say? Or anyone, you don't even have to be a student, you find someone in that camp, what would you say to them to help them like move past it?
So first, I would make sure they have the awareness that that is what is happening, right? So you can't change
Mm-hmm.
anything until you are aware of it. So catch yourself or have a coach help you point out, okay, are you in fact attached? So if the answer is yes, I notice I got attached to, all the haters that commented on my post, or I got attached to the crickets, right? The fact that it was
Right.
crickets. And I made it mean something about myself. So what did you make it mean about yourself? Is that in fact true? And 99.999% of the time, the answer is no, that is a lie. That is just a conditioning I got somewhere in my past.
Right.
Okay, so what can we do as the next step? How can you feel that attachment and release it so you can move forward and post it again, try a different framework. We've got like how many frameworks do we have in our program? Like
A lot. I
20?
don't
I
know.
don't know. I don't even know. I lose track because you keep coming up with new ones. So we literally have such a laundry list of different ways that you can use to communicate the same idea. Try it 20 different ways. Try it 50 different ways. For me personally, even in my own business, I use NGM. That is the number one. That is the only, in fact, not the number one. It's the only messaging frameworks I use inside of my own business. And until I have exhausted every single one of those frameworks, I don't let myself attach to anything,
Yeah.
right? And I can tell you from experience, how long have I been a student of yours? Has it been like 3 years, 4 years? I have yet to exhaust every single framework that you come up with. And every time I think I do, you bring in a slew of new ones.
So I love to do, love to create.
Yep.
Um, yeah, I think that is great advice. I want to go the opposite direction with it too. Do you see it a problem with our students if they get too attached, if they keep getting good results? And do you see that as a problem or
Oh,
not
I
really?
love that question. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And to be fully transparent, I get attached that way too, right? Because
Mhm.
everybody likes to get attached when it's a good result, right? Because then you
Yeah.
make it mean, oh, I nailed it. I know what I'm doing. My
Right.
business is going to now explode, right? It's going to go viral. And overnight, I'm going to have, $20 million in the bank.
Right.
I fall in that too. And so when that happens to me, and when I see it happening with I was about to say with my kids, Freudian slip. When I see it happening with our students, I have to bring myself back to that center too, remind myself it's still just data. It's
Right.
just that it doesn't mean anything either way, right?
Right.
And I think you have to understand and accept that you have to be in that place of neutrality and having no charge with relation to the result, whichever way it goes.
Right.
Otherwise, you will always be seduced one way or another, seduced by the pain or seduced by the pleasure. It doesn't matter. Two sides of
Yeah.
the same coin.
I think it's a great point because I was actually talking to James about this. I mean, literally yesterday. And that's the thing. I think the mistakes that people make is when you become too attached to the great results, what you really see is you see attention, you start getting attention. You're like, oh, let me do this thing to get more attention. And that works out just in human nature. It's like,
Sure.
if you do something as a kid to get your parents' attention, then you keep doing that thing. But as a marketer, as an expert who's creating content, we can't do that because messaging is actually made up of multiple quadrants. There's multiple things. We have 4 quadrants of content that are each designed to gain some sort of thing that you need in order to sell. So maybe it's connection, maybe it's thought leadership, maybe it's perspective shift, or whatever it may be. And if you find out that there's one topic or one theme or one style of content that keeps just getting all these shares, you do that all the time, you actually lose the effectiveness of that thing because your audience gets used to it, number one. But number two, you also neglect all the other things that you still need to figure out. It's like if my thought reversal content's doing great, but I still can't connect with the audience or get them to self-identify what their problem is or diagnose them, then it's not going to do me any good. So either way, positive or negative, good or bad, if you want to put labels on it, we have to get out of the attachment that we have to the results of our content. And that allows for testing and test. Even for me, like I know I've said on the podcast before, when we run ads, 25% of them will work. That's what we did over the last 12 months, 25%, which is actually a really high ratio, which means even for me, who's run millions of dollars in ad spend, has Matt, who's also run millions of dollars outside of our company in ad spend, has created all sorts of creatives. Me, who's written copy on $1 million launches. I've written copy and ads for people like James Wedmore and their $1 million launches. I still have 75% fail rate. When I have 25% of my ads work, it means 75% of them don't, which means that even for me at this level, we're still always testing and you have no idea what will land. And it's about getting the data, learning how to interpret it, and then making adjustments based off that stuff. And this is really how you get to the top. I mean, it's really how we start to figure a lot of these things out. I want to move to another problem, Rachel, that I see. Is we talked about testing and attachment with a lot of our students. But I think the other thing that we have, well, actually, let me see what you think. What is the next problem that you see with our students? And we'll come back to mine later.
So just as a side note, when you
Yep.
were describing the 4 quadrants of messaging, and if you're only seeing results in one of those and then you kind of overexhaust that part, that was me. You described me
Mm,
to a T because in my business, I gained traction with thought reversal content.
mhm.
And then for months, I did only thought reversal content.
Yeah.
And until I had it pointed out by one of our coaches inside the mentorship, because I was a mentorship student who said, you know what? I haven't seen what to do content from you in ages. And I was like,
Right.
wait a minute. I haven't actually done any content outside of thought reversals. I just got so into that loop.
Yeah. I made that
So
mistake too when I first uncovered thought reversals. Like, oh my God, this is amazing. Like we're getting so much traction and did it. And then all of a sudden the traction started dying. People stopped buying. And I'm like, what is going on? I'm like, well, because people don't want their perspective shifted every single time you talk. It's like
it's exhausting.
yeah, you're requiring them to work every single time they consume content from you. And that's the thing I was talking to James about is I think people misconstrue. Well, I think people think attention means sales,
Yeah.
and attention does not mean sales. The
Right.
more attention you have, is there a greater possibility that you make sales? Well, you have more eyeballs on you, so yeah.
Right. But
But
it's not
there's a
enough.
lot of people with big followings that make absolutely no
Yes.
money, and there's also
Yes.
little small followings that make a lot of money. So maybe
Right.
that's the next mistake that we see a lot
That
of
I was
students.
just gonna say this ties into what I was going to
Oh yeah,
say
so go
when
ahead.
you talk about yes, attention is good, okay? So the first step is we do wanna have eyeballs, more eyeballs on us, but then we have to keep them there. How do we do that? The mistake I see entrepreneurs make is they start talking about their solution, their program,
Mhm.
their benefits, why someone should buy from them and not from someone else. And it is, I think it's, as you would say to me, too deep, too fast.
Yeah,
So
also
again,
unnecessary.
it's not the right time, right? There we have to be very sensitive as entrepreneurs. And going through a sales process, taking people from cold to sold, we have to
Mhm.
be very sensitive during that process where people are at and meet them there at every stage of the process. It's not just at the top of our funnel. It's not enough when to get their attention and then right away go into our solution. they're not there yet with us. We
Yeah.
have to take them every step of the way and be very mindful of our own pacing, that we're not, we're in our eagerness to
Right.
share our
Right.
solution, to change the world, to, release people from their suffering, whatever it is that we're trying to do. We are
Right.
a little too eager. And I'm the first person who does this. We're a little too eager to share what it is we do and why it's so amazing and why they should, buy from us.
Well, and usually what happens when we do that, we depend on our modules, our videos, our downloads, our workbooks, our bonuses to do the selling for us. When honestly, like people should already be sold on you before they even get to that offer. And so I think a lot of people go when they pitch or present the offer, they that's when the selling starts, but they don't recognize that selling is starting in the content. And that's the biggest thing we do is we focus on profitable messaging. So it's how do you get your audience to feel like number one, you hear them, which is has to be required for you to sell. Like they have to feel like you understand them in their specific situation. But then how do you not only position your product, but how do you position working with you as the solution? And so what we have found is that, and again, this goes back to what we talked about originally with the testing of the problems and the mistakes. When we have communication, again, that can happen in an ad content, beginning of a webinar, that's describing here's the problem you're experiencing, here's why it's happening, blah, 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 blah. That person starts to become like, this person gets me. They feel heard by them. They have a solution. And what starts to happen is there's an internal desire, demand to work with you. And it doesn't matter if you have a course, a coaching program, or a service. They're like, just tell me I'm sold. Like I'm done. Like put a fork in me. I'm done. I'm ready to buy. Just what do you have for me? That's where we want our audience to get. And I think that's kind of a little bit of a mind F for a lot of people to get around, because the next question is like, well, how do I even do that? But that is, again, when you come into the program, we're going to be literally changing the way in which you communicate, and the way in which you communicate obviously can make people feel certain things. So if you're going to be an a-hole or yell at your kids, or an a-hole to your spouse because you're fed up with something, your communication is probably gonna be pretty poor. But if you're very like grounded and thinking about it and try different communication styles, you can eventually get through. It's the same thing with your audience. So again, going back to the problem is I think people just don't know how to create demand.
And the other thing is also, I think sometimes we get entrepreneurs, certainly when they're already at, let's say, 500,000 or above per
Mhm.
revenue per year. They have gained some traction, right? They have
Right.
some traction. People are paying attention, and it's not translating into sales, or not as much as it should, right? It's not, that
Yeah.
conversion is not working as well as it should. And I think the mistake that most people make at that level is not understanding that that is a symptom of disjointed messaging in your funnel.
Mm. It's disjointed, and man, there's so many topics we can go into this. So disjointed, I'm going to come back to that in a second. But another thing I've noticed, Rachel, is and this could happen at any level. I know you're specifically talking about people at like 500, 400, something in that range. But what I've seen is that at any level, it could be zero, it could be 10 million. At any level, when there is a plateau or even a decline of sales, it means your messaging has done
Right.
one of two things. It's either lost its effectiveness because it's not relevant to what people are going through anymore because times change, or you have what I call cold messaging warm messaging instead of cold messaging, where warm messaging works for a while. You build an audience and then you get to like, let's call it 3, 4, 500, 600,000, sometimes even a million. And what happens is the messaging you've been using to get that level has
Yeah.
lost steam with the people that are already there. They've seen the offer a million times. They know what you have. They've already made a decision of no, and you've tapped out your warm traffic.
Right.
And the only way to scale that is to get more warm traffic, but the messaging you're using isn't growing the audience as fast as you want sales to grow. So let's say you have 100,000 people on Instagram, you're making $1 million a year. Now to make 2 million, you quite literally need another 100,000. But to gain that other 100,000 followers is not going to happen at the same speed you want to get to that 2 million mark. And so
Right.
we need what we call cold messaging, which means that it doesn't matter if they know you or don't know you. You're so relevant and so on point that they just all day long are coming into the ecosystem. So that's what I've noticed as well. But I would love to go back to the disjointed funnel. Can you kind of explain what that is to the audience?
I think a lot of times, well, what it is really is that there isn't a coherent, cohesive messaging ecosystem from
Yeah.
point A to all the way to the sale. Point A being the absolute top of your funnel, where someone who's never heard of you before encounters you, whether it's on your podcast or your social media or any kind of content that you put out, and someone comes across, now that their attention is on you, they're in your ecosystem. How do you, in a cohesive, coherent way, bring them all the way to the point of the sale? Because I
Mhm.
think what a lot of people think is, okay, I got them in, let's say, at the top of my social media from a post or a reel. Now, all I have to do is get them to the next step, which is, let's
Yeah.
say, a webinar that I'm hosting. And then on that webinar, I'm going to pitch them into a program. And then when they're in that program, I'm going to pitch them into another program. And the way people are looking at it is more like I'm just like going to hop from one step to the next instead of how do I build a cohesive ecosystem. So even if someone, let's say, comes in to this webinar that I'm hosting, it doesn't matter if they've gone through the top of my funnel or not.
Mhm.
They are in the same messaging ecosystem. So everything is just a smooth transition all the way through. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So just to kind of like recap, um, like let's just call it a webinar funnel. There's
Mhm.
potentially going to be, 4 or 5 steps. There's going to be an ad, which is maybe the cold audience's first like touch point, right?
Right,
But your warm audience won't see the ad because they could just get a social media post or like an email invite to the webinar.
right,
And then there could be someone who's like, buddy just said, hey, come to this webinar and sent them the direct link. And so now you have someone who's never been on the webinar or seen the ad or the original email or something like that. So step one would be ad. Step two is like you get an email or confirmation email. Step three is like you're actually on the webinar. So you're
right,
going to have people coming into that webinar. Some could be step three could be their first touch point. Step
right.
one and an ad could be their first touch point. What I hear you saying is that a disjointed funnel means there's almost separate messaging, which is
Yes.
almost lure based in the ad, and then there's completely different messaging in the webinar. Although it's the same topic, the communication style shifts and changes where the ad might say, hey, do you want to learn how to create a 7-figure webinar? Like join this step. And then they get on the webinar and it may say something like, okay, here's how to fix broken webinars.
Right,
And although that may seem very similar, it's not the same messaging.
right,
It's, I came in to learn how to create a 7-figure webinar. I didn't come in to learn how to fix a broken webinar because maybe you're at a 6-figure webinar. It's not
right.
broken, it's doing 6 figures, but you're like, okay, now this is not relevant to me. And so now what you did is you brought a bunch of
Lost
people
them.
in thinking they were going to create a 7-figure webinar. And now they're on a training on how to fix a broken webinar. And
Right, and why that is because you didn't pay attention to their buying behavior. So
right,
even though your ad is it's free to click on an ad, that is still a buying decision. So
right,
I bought it for 0, but it is a decision that I made as a cold audience. You, as an entrepreneur, you have to pay attention to these decisions that your audience is making, and the messaging needs to be coherent based on those decisions.
yep. And I'm gonna even go back on what I said. As I said, step one is the ad. After hearing what Rachel just said, it reminds me step one is actually your content, which goes back to what we were talking about originally. Is that's why testing is so important because we want to pay
Right,
attention to what are the topics that are doing really well, what's the problems that are doing really well. Then guess what? It's working well in the content, probably going to work well in the ad. So let's put it in the ad. Let's do 5 or 6, 10 different variations of copy and angles and see which one works the best. And then you basically carry all that messaging through every step of the way.
Right.
And the biggest objection we get from students is, yeah, but I'm saying the same thing in
Right.
the ad as the email as the webinar. I'm like, yeah,
It's
because you
supposed to be that
should.
way.
That's
Yeah.
exactly what you should be doing,
Yeah.
because there's and a couple of reasons, people need to hear things multiple times before it lands.
Right.
Even if they hear it multiple times and they're growing as a person, as a business owner, as whatever, when
Right.
they hear you say it a second, third, fourth, 10th time, they hear it differently.
Yeah.
It lands differently with them every single time that they hear it, because they have new levels of awareness. And
Right.
so the way I look at it is, and you heard Rachel mention a couple of times, we want to know what is going to work before we do something. And we look at people's behavior to make that decision. What behavior is the best behavior on our content? What content pulls out the best behavior you want? Let's inject that same wording in the ads, and let's pay attention to the behavior. And we're just going to say the same thing. Maybe we can say it a little bit differently or go deeper with it the deeper they get in the funnel. Because like in an ad, you have 30 seconds to get a
Right.
point across. In a webinar, you have 60 minutes. So you
Right.
have the room to go a little bit deeper with things, but that's basically what we want. And what most people do is like what Rachel said, is that they create a disjointed funnel where it's every step is literally just a lure to get someone to the next step, without any consideration of how is this helping create demand, solve a problem, making people aware, building connection. Nothing's intentional. It's literally just, let me dangle a carrot in front of your face until you get to my offer. And then I'm hoping my modules, my bonuses are enough to like convince you to buy.
Right. And in a subtle way, this also ties back into what we were talking about with attachment to
Mm,
results, because and getting it right, right? That urge,
yeah,
that need to get things right also plays in to creating disjointed funnels, because people try to come up with all kinds of super creative ways to say basically the same thing, but in a different way. And one of the things we help people do inside of our program is actually, no, 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 this is way less work than you think it is. Because if you've done the testing up front and
right,
you've uncovered what are the topics that are your, what we call your $1 million messaging topics. Okay, now you have it. Now you can just use it, plug and play with all the frameworks that we have inside of our program. And it becomes so much less work to create that very simple funnel than what people are doing right now.
right. Well, I will say the testing is work.
Mhm.
That's where the bulk of the work comes in. But once that initial process is done, you now have a foundation of literally just plugging it into everything. You plug it into an ad, into a webinar, into a piece of content, and then all of a sudden the effectiveness level of everything starts to go up. Okay, so we talked about. Let's just recap what we've talked about so far. We've talked about people focus more on knowledge and their skills and the transformation than they do problems. We need to figure out the problems and the problems people are willing to pay for in order to get fixed. We talked about testing. So people, one of the mistakes is they don't embrace testing, or they move too slow. So testing just takes forever. We talked about being too attached. We talked about the difference of creating demand. So instead of trying to sell all the time, to focus on demand creation and disjointed funnels. Are there any other mistakes that you see a lot of the students make that you think would be beneficial for the audience?
I think these are kind of what I call like the big three or the big four
Right.
that I see reoccurring really at every revenue level. So
Yeah.
that's, I feel like a very interesting thing to observe, that we work with people, for anywhere from 0 to 8 figures and beyond. And really, when it comes to messaging, people struggle with pretty much the same things at every different level. So it's
Right.
just a very interesting kind of observation, I think. I don't know. I'm curious your thoughts on that, but I find
Yeah.
it interesting.
Well, and that's also intentional too, is I kind of developed our messaging and marketing to attract people at all levels. And
Mm,
I just focus on the problems that they both have. But that's the thing. And again, you have some people that are, I call it lucky. It's like they're kind of lucky because they just started putting content out and they just did things right and they took off because of it. But they eventually hit a plateau because it goes stale. And again, I've seen those plateaus happen at 500, 2 million. I have a client right now that plateaued at 7 million. And it's
yeah.
like now they came to me like, how do we get past this thing? Um, so yeah, it happens at all levels. And if you're the person who's stuck at the zero plateau at zero sales, I understand that too, because that was me like 9 years ago. And that's the worst. That's the worst
It's the
plateau to be
worst.
at. That's the most frustrating,
I've been
obviously.
there too. I've been there too.
Yeah.
It sucked.
It's terrible. But yeah, so I think the testing is really important, obviously, to get to that level. The thing I think that a lot of people don't recognize when they come into the program is they're like, oh, cool, I'm going to figure out my messaging. But what they don't really realize is that this is like it's a communication program. So it'll change the way in how you communicate. And you're going to have some compassion for yourself because, for me, I'm 39. I've been talking one way in one style of communication for 39 years. Well, probably 35 years because I teach
Mhm.
messaging now, but either way, it's like 30 plus years of one way of communicating,
Yeah.
which is a very deep rooted pattern
Yes.
and behavior.
Yes.
And to like, you're going to have to undo that.
Right.
And when you do that, like, again, it's not just your content, it's literally going to change the effectiveness of your live streams, or when you get on stage, or even how you talk to your kids or your friends or your spouse. Like, I like this program, like learning messaging and doing everything in here has actually improved even my relationship with my kids, because I'm like, it changed the way in how I communicate. And I think that's the next problem I wanted to talk about is, I think people, for great communication, you need to speak from the perspective of someone else.
Yeah.
And that means you need to have awareness of where they are at. And so, like, for example, if my kid's like on the floor screaming, like, I'm not going to go up and scream, like, get off the floor and stop crying. I'm going to start with like, where are they at? Okay, they're upset by something. What is something that I can do to like start the conversation? Like,
Right.
maybe it's, I see you're really upset right now. What's going on? Do you want to talk about it?
Right.
Or maybe you get on the floor and cry with them, said, I'm sad that you're sad. I'm going to be here with you, and you start to change. And then all of a sudden their behavior starts to shift. But again, to be able to recognize that and to shift it, it takes a completely different style of communication that you've been used to in the past. And I want people to be prepared for that. So if you're on the fence, like, be prepared for us to change your relationships for the better. But it's going to take, again, it takes work in order for that to happen as well.
Yeah, and I love that you brought that up. And first of all, every time you give these examples with your kids, you make me like tear up. So stop.
Yeah.
But also, I think this is actually a problem worth talking about that people or a mistake people make. Messaging is everything. All the problems you have in your business right now, I guarantee you, are a result of problematic messaging. Because this is the thing that I think people are not aware of. They think they have an offer problem. They think they have a tech problem. They're not enough tech, not a big enough team, can't scale. Sales calls are not going great. People don't understand that messaging is at the root of all these problems. These are
Yeah.
just different ways that messaging shows up for you in your business, depending on what stage you're at in your business, what revenue levels, all kinds of factors. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how amazing you are, how much expertise you have, how much knowledge you have, how much knowing you have, if you can't communicate that in a way that people can hear, it doesn't matter.
Right. It has to land with that other person. I mean,
Exactly.
I'm a believer. We might be getting a little bit off topic now, but I'm just a believer that 100%, and I'm very rarely will ever say 100%. I'll say 99% of problems in this world that you experience come down to a lack of communication between you and someone
Right.
else, is usually
Right.
what it comes down to. Like, even with your content, it's like, yeah, you have an attachment issue, like we talked about.
Mhm.
But even to the point where that attachment even comes up was because you lacked a way of communicating. And again, we have to go through testing, but if you had communicated it perfectly in your first test and got some sort of result, then it wouldn't be that negative attachment. So it's like, even with my wife and my kids and team members,
Right.
it comes down to a lack of communication. And that's essentially what messaging is. And you and I have done so many sales calls with our students before they became students, and we've seen
Yes.
everything from people thinking that messaging is just copy
Yes.
to they need another strategy, or they need to buy someone else's course or program because they're not driving the sales. And they don't realize like there's a million people that use the same strategy as you, but they're converting and you're not. In fact, some of
Right.
them could be selling a very similar course, and they just mastered the art of how to communicate it in a way that creates demand, resonates with people. And that's what we're here to do. That's what we're here to fix.
Right. And at the end of the day, when I look at what do people want? People want to be heard.
Yeah.
That's it. It's so simple. When you boil it down, it's very simple.
Yeah.
People want to be heard. If you can demonstrate that you can hear your people, you've got your messaging dialed in.
That's 100% true. However, I don't want people to think this means you need to listen to your audience all the time.
No.
What Rachel's talking about is communicating in a way where your audience goes, this person gets it. They're talking about me.
Yeah.
And you can even use emotional things in your content too. Like you probably feel like, you want to climb to the top of a mountain and scream. You feel you have that feeling in the pit of your stomach. You're doing X, Y, and Z. That's what Rachel's talking about, is validating people's situation, talking about why things occur inside of their life. And obviously when you do that, they're not aware of why those things are happening. So you bring that awareness to them. That's what being heard is. Do you want to expand on that at all?
Yeah, and it's actually, when you gave the example of your kids, if your kid is having a meltdown and crying on the floor, what you did was you said, "Okay, let me get curious about what is happening. What is this experience like for my kid right now? Like clearly they're upset over something. I don't know what that is. I'm going to be curious." And that's
Mhm.
all you did, right? You didn't fix their problem, you didn't teach them anything, you didn't coach them out of anything. You didn't offer a solution even. You just said,
Right.
"Okay, you're upset. I'm calling it out. This is the situation. I'm just going to be here with you."
Right.
And the reason it shifted their behavior is because they felt heard. They were like, "Oh, he got it. He
Right.
got me. My dad got me. He sees me in this moment. I'm upset. And that's all he wants to do is just be with me." So if we can take that into the business kind of, layer it into business, your people, your audience are crying on the floor.
Yeah.
And all you need to do is get on the floor and say, "Hey, I see you crying and I understand what that's like."
Right.
That's it. That is enough to validate the experience that they're having. The experience being, I'm not getting any sales. I can't scale. My messaging is falling flat. Nobody's engaging in my content. I have no team and I'm drowning in all the things I need to do as an entrepreneur, right? Whatever that crying, melting down on the floor looks like for your audience, all you need to do is show them that you know what that's like, that you
Right.
understand that they are on the floor crying. That is validating.
Right. And that's what making your audience heard feels like. And just keep in mind, like that is one quadrant of everything that you need to do, but it is the first starting point. And I use her as an example all the time, but the holistic psychologist does this
Mhm.
so well. And I would say most of her content is this. It's like, here's what you're going through, and I understand it. Or she'll even use her own experience of like, here's what I've gone through. But
Right,
that's all she does, is she outlines scenarios that
right,
allow you to be heard and seen and go, that's me. And
right.
my wife's a perfect example. She loves following her Nicole. I think it's Nicole. I don't remember her last
LaPera.
name. Yeah, following her content. And honestly, a lot of how I come up with great messaging frameworks and stuff is I just look at what other people are doing and how they made me feel. But with the holistic psychologist, I remember it. It was about a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago. I remember it very specifically. My wife sitting there on the phone scrolling Instagram, and she's like, "I just love this person, the holistic psychologist." And I was like, "Oh, really?" She's like, "Yeah." She's like, "I just feel so heard." And
Yeah,
it was like, for me, that was like 2 years ago when the dots connected. I'm like, how does she feel heard through like image-based content with text on it? I don't understand. And I started taking a look, and I was like, oh, I get it. She's
Right.
validating experience that you're going through and then giving an explanation of why that's happening. And she's like, I feel heard and I feel like someone finally gets it, gets me. But what's really interesting is that that piece of content had like 100,000 likes on it.
Yeah.
And I was like,
Right.
wow, she was able with a single post to be so relevant to millions of people. And I'm like, this is what we need to do. This is what, as marketers, we need to find out what are the main problems and reasons why these problems exist for our audience and find the ones that are the most that are specific, but the relevant to the most amount of people. And even for in our own stuff, like as soon as we started doing that, especially in ads, it's like our ads went from like 15% effectiveness rate up to 25. And that's, and again, it comes down to everything we talked about today. In order to get to that point, you need testing. You need to change the way you're communicating. You need to be less attached to a lot of things. You need to start focusing on demand creation. All of that stuff
Right,
is
and
what you're
notice
looking at.
when you talked about, Nicole's content 2 years ago, a year and a half or 2 years ago, she wasn't doing reels, she didn't have a
Mhm,
podcast yet. So this was
mhm.
just carousels.
Right,
Literally, there was nothing besides carousels. No actual images of her, no videos of her, no audio content,
right,
no emails. So this was so simple in terms of the actual output. So I highlight this because a lot of times our students think, okay, well, I can't do all the things. It's too
right.
much, right? I can't have a podcast and do reels and show up on camera
I don't
and
want
report
you
on
to. Pick one,
right,
master it. That's the other thing too is I think that's another mistake I see all the time too. Which you just remind me is I think people move from platform to platform too quickly. They're like, Brandon, it's not working. That I'm gonna try like YouTube again. It's like, no, you're falling back into the same pattern, thinking that it's something else besides your messaging is the problem. Like I've seen people succeed with YouTube channels, with just Instagram, with just reels, just images, with podcasts. And I think it's another mistake students make is they think just because they have a framework that we have, that everything should work right off the bat. And it's like, no, you still need to fill that framework up with the right words, which requires testing. And it's not the platform. Like
right,
it's you're not failing because you're not on TikTok and you're on Instagram instead. You're not failing because you're using YouTube versus a podcast.
right,
Literally doesn't effing matter.
right.
I can go give me a stage, give me a virtual stage, give me a YouTube channel, give me an Instagram. I'm going to be successful. Why? Because I know how to communicate with
Yes.
people and create demand for what I do because I put
Yes.
in years of testing.
And that goes along with the fact that the strategy doesn't matter as much as the messaging. So when you have
Yeah.
your messaging, then you can do you wanna do a challenge? Do a challenge. You wanna launch? Launch. You wanna have evergreen? Have evergreen. You wanna do webinars? Do webinars. It doesn't
Right.
effing matter, literally.
Right. And I will say, like, strategy does come into play, but like Rachel said, the reason why a current strategy isn't working is 95% of the time, it's not because you chose the wrong strategy. It's because you don't know how to communicate within that strategy
Right.
is usually what it is. Okay. Before we wrap up, are there any last mistakes that kind of popped up into your awareness as we were going, or do you think we kind of covered them all?
I think we covered a lot, and, I think the nugget, the gold nugget that I've always taken from not just working with our students, but actually from working with you, Brandon,
Mhm.
is my business revolves around this core pillar. Messaging is everything. If you don't
Mhm.
have messaging, nothing else is gonna work.
It won't. And that's so true. It's like you could have the wrong strategy, and if you're using great messaging, it'll still work. But if you have the best strategy in the world and terrible messaging, it just plain won't work. It
Right.
just won't. So it is the foundation of everything. It is one of those things that I wish people would recognize sooner. This is the one thing you should start with. But what we have found is, usually what happens is people get to some sort of plateau and they've been stuck that plateau for usually about 3 months or sometimes longer, but a minimum of 3 months before they finally recognize, oh, it's the messaging.
Yeah.
What's really weird is I think we've been so brainwashed in the space to think that it is strategy that yeah, I
Mm.
know you and I have both had sales calls with people and that are literally said like, well, my content's doing great
Mhm.
and I'm getting viewers and getting people opting in, but I can't turn them into sales. And they're like, so it's not a messaging issue, it's a strategy issue.
Right.
And it's like, no,
It's a mess.
it's a message, if like you have messaging that's good enough for people to listen, but you don't have messaging good enough to get them to buy. And the strategy is not going to change. We've literally had people go, or people have told us like, well, I just need a team to help me. And that's why I'm not getting sales. It's like, how the
Nope.
hell is a team going to help you get sales? I don't understand. Like, it's just so bizarre. And I think that's one of the biggest things is people also can't recognize when they have a messaging issue, but I'll make it very simple for you. If you can't get views on your content, messaging problem. If you can't get those, if you are getting views and they're not opting in for anything, messaging problem. If they are opting in for something and they're not buying, messaging problem. So there's 3 different levels. It's like they have to, like you said, you have to get the eyeballs on you. Then we have to keep the eyeballs on you. And then we have to convert them. And if you're not doing all 3 of those, there is a messaging breakdown somewhere. But the beautiful part is we can look at the data and tell you exactly where the problem is based off what you're experiencing. So,
I love that.
yeah. All right. Well, let's wrap up here. Rachel, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast. For anyone who is on the fence thinking about joining, do you have any last words before we wrap up?
You know what? I would honestly say if this is something that piques your interest, then reach out to us. We are more than happy to get on a call with you and show you how this works in your own business. We can look at your current messaging. We can tell you where your gaps are. We can give you your next best steps. So, and it's,
I can
why
also
not?
tell you if you're ready for it too. There's
Right.
just some people who aren't ready for our program,
Right.
and they're not ready because, maybe they don't want to do any testing or whatever. Like we've had over 1,400 people in the program. We know pretty clearly by now who gets an ROI, who doesn't, who's going to see results, who's not going to see results.
Right.
So if you're on the fence and you're like, this is what I need, and I'm just want to talk it out, feel free to book a call with us. We have it in our Facebook group. You guys can go do that. And the thing is if you are on this podcast and you recognize that, maybe it is messaging that I need help with or struggle with, if you're not going to do it now, when? Like the problem's still going to exist. How long are you willing to deal with that problem before we finally get it addressed? And I understand Rachel and I and my team may not be the people that jive with you, and then maybe someone else. That's fine, but you still need to go get the help. If you're
Yeah.
leaving this podcast with the awareness now that messaging is the issue, it's time to get it fixed. And we would love to help you out. So,
Well,
yeah.
I would leave the listeners with this question. And this is a question I ask myself when I'm in a kind of an inflection point in my own business or a crossroads where I recognize something's not working. And even if I don't know exactly what that is and what kind of help I need, this is the question I ask myself. This is the question I would have you guys, the listeners, ask yourselves. Put Brandon aside, okay? Let's say you don't get help from Brandon. What is your game plan? What
Yeah.
is the plan to get you out of where you are right now without Brandon? Just leave him aside. We'll throw him out the window for now.
See ya. Yeah. I mean, a lot of people, that's a great question because I don't think a lot of people have a plan. And it's just
Right?
crazy sometimes. Like, I don't know, I'll just figure it out. And it's like, well, you've already been doing that. Like, how much longer are you willing to do
So,
that?
someone said this to me once. I used to think to myself, well, if I mean, I consider myself like I'm an intelligent person. I'm not stupid. How come I can't figure it out?
Mhm.
And someone said to me, if you had the winning lottery ticket, don't you think you would have cashed it in already? And I was
Yeah.
like, damn, yeah,
Well, if you do find that and you're ready to like get the winning lottery ticket, as Rachel would say, we're ready for you. Come on
yeah,
in. Um, but yeah, that is the thing. And again, I don't want to push anyone into any program, but like I'm also not shy around the fact of we're here to help you. And a lot of the times this sort of thing just doesn't get solved on its own. You got to remember, like Rachel said, intuitively, I just get messaging. I can see it. I can see patterns. I can read a book and go know exactly why someone got me to feel a certain thing. And it took me 4 years to get to the point of what you could have access to literally with one click of a button. I mean, it's all sitting there for you guys. So we welcome any and all new students. If you guys need any help, let us know. We'd be happy to have a conversation with you. Um, and hopefully we'll see you in the program. If not, I'll just see you guys next week on another episode. Take care, everyone. Talk to you all soon. Hey guys, thank you so much for checking out another episode of the New Generation Entrepreneur Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, go below, hit the subscribe button, and make sure you click on that bell icon and get notified every time we drop a new episode. Now, if you're looking for the show notes, we have them linked underneath this video, as well as our social media handles and some links to free training and offers that we drop from time to time to help you guys even further. So go check those out if you're interested, and thank you so much for tuning in to the New Generation Entrepreneur Podcast.